Hello, my Substack readers and subscribers. This is Donald Earl Collins again. Hi. Wanted to talk about the things that have happened over the past week. This is just some sort of a weekly thing to stay abreast of current affairs and see how they relate in some ways, in some ways, to the work that I'm doing on in the Substack around um, being an educated fool in the worlds of academia and the nonprofit world, and as a writer, and also, just thinking about the world to come. What does a post-Western world look like? Well, hopefully, it doesn't look like what we've seen in the past week with more. What the media has been calling racial violence, right? Or racially motivated violence, or racially tinged violence, like what happened in Jacksonville after a white supremacist, white nationalist who has a manifesto that basically says that he hates black people, decided to try to first descend upon the local HBCU in the Jacksonville area, but security stopped him from coming in, and then he decided to go to a Dollar General or a Family Dollar in Jacksonville because he knew he could find black people there and start shooting them up and killed 3 people in the process. People who are, in at least one case, or a parent, people who, obviously sons and daughters of other people who are just going about living their ordinary lives. And it's not so ironic that we know that he picked a neighborhood that would be exploited socioeconomically, because the neighborhood probably has relatively higher levels of poverty than other pockets of the country. So, because that's where you would normally find a Dollar General or Family Dollar in this country. And that disproportionately the people who shop there would be black. So he knew enough to use his his racist stereotypes to execute his racist plans of violent mass shooting, right? And so that speaks to a lot of what's been happening in this country of late, and it speaks to the fact that, in point of fact, we are headed toward, possibly a second civil war. At least these folks who are the heteronormative white male, folks who are incels who fully believe that there's already a race war going on. That's what they want anyway, right? That's one thing. Then the University of North Carolina shooting and lockdown of the university, which happened within 2 days of that, is a whole nother thing, right? And I bring all this up in part because, Labor Day was just a couple of days ago, Labor Day weekend, and what does that mean in terms of labor work? And so in this particular case, a work site, a major elite public university, locked down for 3 hours because of a shooting. But the shooting in this case involved a faculty advisor who was killed by a faculty advisee. Meaning the graduate student who was being advised by this faculty advisor came in and shot him, presumably over a grade or over something else that was going on. We don't really know the full story yet. We might never know the full story. But people have been comparing the two incidents like all mass shootings are the same. No, they are not. First of all, technically speaking, I shouldn't even say kid, what the um, graduate student did at University of North Carolina, which did in fact call for an abundance of caution, a lockdown, and scared the crap out of people, right? People left out of windows, went across, buildings and all kinds of other things in order to hidden closets in order to lock down, right? Hidden bathrooms and stuff. And that's still traumatized. But that's the cumulative effect of mass shootings across the country, which have included mass shootings at universities. But there is a difference between somebody seeking to kill a whole bunch of people because I don't like black people, or because this is a white man's country and I'm going to be John Brown, no pun intended here, in order to make sure this country remains in the purview of white people, because from their perspective, the most oppressed group of people in the country are white guys, right? Cis heteronormative incel white guys, right? Of course, for those of you who don't know, incel means involuntary celibacy, meaning that no one wants to sleep with these guys because they are so toxic that even, the average standard cis hetero white woman who, typically is anti-gay, anti-queer, anti-trans, etc. Doesn't want to be bothered. They don't want to be bothered. No one wants to be, right? So that's hence where the term comes from. I'm assuming. Actually, I know. I'm not just assuming. Anyway, but that is a different category than someone who has laser focus on taking out one person's life. Still murder, still not right, but taking out one person's life in order to basically feel a sense of revenge or relief on the basis of that. The reason why I think they're different is because I can empathize on some level of what this person did at University of North Carolina. Not that I've actually ever seriously planned it or done it, but I've definitely thought about that. Because I had a faculty advisor, I had a PhD advisor when I was at Carnegie Mellon, or for those of you from Pittsburgh area, Carnegie Mellon University, who was on my PhD committee, whose name I've used numerous times, used in my first book, talked about in terms of professional development over the years, who, well, drove me to the point where for about 8 months of my life, between April of 1996 and December of 96, to the point where I dreamt about killing him. I had daydreams and I had actual dreams in which I would, somehow I found some piano wire, presumably in the music department or the theater department of Carnegie Mellon University, because they have a theater building, walked across campus, went into his office, grabbed him from behind. He's about five at the time because he was about, 50, 51, 52 years old. 51 years old. Grabbed him from behind because I was still 6'3" now, 6'3" back then, and just took the piano wire, shoved it into his throat, and just pulled and yanked while suffocating him until basically I broke the skin and cut off veins and arteries and got him to bleed out. This is literally how vivid the daydream, the macabre, murderous daydream that I had, and the dreams that I had about this. I probably had about maybe 9 in all between April and December of 96, while I was finishing my dissertation, because he had been a stumbling block for a year and a half. He had done all kinds of things to keep me from because he wanted to control how I finished, right? He wanted to be in control of when I finished, how I finished, and what kinds of jobs I could and couldn't apply for. Um, to the point where he would write abusive messages in drafts of chapters of my dissertation, telling me that I didn't do these things that he told me to do. And I'm reading this and I'm going, what did you tell me to do? I mean, I had to read in between the lines to figure out what it is that he was trying to tell me to do while working on my dissertation that wasn't directly related to anything he was doing research on. He wanted me to be a facsimile for a thesis that he had about Black working class development and Black migration, what was once known as the proletarianization thesis, which doesn't apply evenly across all sites of Black migration, depending on city and suburb, over the course of the 20th century. I'm not going to get into all the details around it. Bottom line is, he was abusive. He was verbally abusive at times. He was abusive in terms of his written language toward me. He wouldn't write letters, for jobs when I was done with first draft of a dissertation. I'm like the whole draft's done. It's mostly done. I mean, I have to fix some things, but it's mostly done, and people agree it's generally done. No, I'm not writing a letter for you until you're all the way done because you might not be able to finish it. I'm like, wait a minute. I have 8 chapters of an 8-chapter dissertation basically done, and you're not going to write a letter for me for a postdoc or for a job, right? He was constantly running interference to keep me from, doing conferences, or getting mad when I did conferences and telling me, if you're going to go all over the country to do a conference, you can damn sure do a conference here. Things like that he would say to me, all right? He would basically tell me not to publish stuff because the people around here talk, and the people around here might. I'm assuming he meant white folks, right? Because he was, only tenured black professor in the department for most of the time I was there, um, would talk about me and maybe prevent me from doing stuff in the future. So he didn't want me publishing anything, right? Unless it was something that had his name on it. Like if I was doing entries for the AHA Guide to American History or something like that was fine because his name was on it. But if it was just me on my own, no, he didn't want me publishing anything. This went on. At first, it just seemed a little weird, but over the course of the 4 years I worked with him, especially after I became a Spencer Fellow in 1995-96, which wasn't supposed to happen. I found out from the Spencer Foundation, the person that was on the committee that selected me to get the fellowship, the dissertation fellowship, that my advisor had not written me a glowing letter of recommendation at all. In fact, he basically did so much to tamp down what I did that it actually confused committee members as to whether he was recommending me for the fellowship or not. I got it anyway, right? And so all of that, all these things I learned about him, especially that year and a half going into those final 8 months when I was finishing up my dissertation, I felt betrayed. I mean, I felt a sense of betrayal that I'd only felt a couple of other times in my life, right? I mean, just worse than the betrayal that happens when someone cheats on you. Worse than that. Way worse than that. I felt that, a couple of other times. And those other times I felt that I probably was either depressed or so angry that I wanted to see somebody get hurt. And that's what happened in this situation. So I stayed as far away from him as possible those last 8 months. I didn't want to be bothered, except for the fact that I wanted to finish my dissertation. But at a certain point, once I got back those first comments about my first draft and his refusal to write letters, I was at the point where I was like, either I'm going to be done or this guy's going to be dead. Right? That's literally where I was at. And the only thing that stopped me, really the only thing that stopped me, was the realization that this guy ain't worth it. This guy, no matter how powerful and prominent a person they are in their field professionally, is not worth it for me to make this so personal, because it is personal at a certain level, because you're invested, you're fully invested in getting this degree, you're fully invested in having this career. So the personal and the professional come together, whether you want it to or not. It's one of the lessons here anyway, right? That I'm not giving up my freedom. I'm not giving my relative amount of freedom in a country that already wants to put black guys in jail for pretty much anything. Because I killed this guy, because I murdered this guy. So, you know, so I didn't. I didn't do it. But my final straw in dealing with him was after he had approved the dissertation. He was the last person on my committee. After the other people on my committee have already said, "This is great," or this more than meets the threshold. Doesn't quite do everything you wanted it to do. I feel, and I could talk about what one of these people said in general later. But you're done, right? He took his time, finally approved it, and then a month later said, "Apply. These are the jobs I think you should apply for. These are jobs I want you to apply for." And the jobs he wanted me to apply for were jobs that hadn't had funding approved for them yet. Specifically, one in Queens borough of New York City, which would have been great because that would have taken me back to my home, toward my hometown, but no approval yet for funding. And University of Nebraska Omaha, which also did not have approved for funding, and actually funding for both of those jobs turned out would fall through that year. And I looked at him like, this is what you want me to do? No, I'm going to do what I want to do, right? I went back to him 6 months later after I officially graduated and officially had my doctorate and everything else, and basically said, we both did things that I don't think were very good. I apologize for the things that you might have perceived for me to do. I didn't tell him about the fact that he might have died, he might have gotten killed by me if I had decided to follow through on some of these murderous dreams I was having, right? But I decided, I'm not going to tell him that. So, I said, I hope you forgive me. I forgive you, and moved on. And to some extent, I had forgiven him. But I still had the occasional recurrence of these dreams, probably another half dozen times between 1997 and 2014, which is the last time I had one. And the one in 2014, that's the first time I had one probably in about 12 or 13 years. So I'm kind of like, what the heck did that come from, right? And I think it came from the fact that it wasn't where I wanted to be professionally, right? All, bottom line. And you invest so much of effort and so much time to do the things that you want to do, to get a master's degree, get a PhD, that when you are betrayed, when the person that who's supposed to be advising you and mentoring you abuses you, right? Abuses you in ways that, especially if you've been abused in the past, whether physically or psychologically or sexually, and I've actually experienced all of those. Yeah, you're going to be pissed. You're going to be pissed to the point where you might have actions. Now, my empathy toward what happened is, what may have occurred, what could have possibly occurred in the University of North Carolina is not the same as me saying, go ahead and kill somebody. That is hardly what I'm saying. But I am saying that we live in a toxic country, very violent country, and academia is an extremely toxic environment to do, where people have almost absolute power over you. I mean, I can't name a Research One university in the United States that has, as part of the process of having people who advise students, graduate students, whether they're master's students, whether they're PhDs, EDDs, or some other, doctorate kind of student. I've never seen where the advisor himself or herself or themselves has to report to a committee of their own, a review committee that makes sure that you don't exercise your power in capricious, craven, I'm going to steal from my student and exploit their work kinds of ways. I'm going to make this student, mold them into a younger version of me kinds of ways, in ways that basically leave students needing mental health services. Go see a social worker, go see a psychologist, a psychiatrist, right? I probably, between, I'd say, April of 96 and maybe February of 1999, probably should have seen a psychologist, psychiatrist, because in many ways, my relationship with my former advisor reminded me of my relationship with my, at that point, idiot ex-stepfather, because that's what I called him at that point, because my mom and my stepfather had divorced when I was 19 and all that other stuff, right? And he was abusive in many, many ways, and dealing with my former advisor was a lot like that, without the physical abuse part, but the psychological, the constant threats, the running interference, you're not ready, all these other things that he would regularly say to me, even while I was a Spencer Fellow and presenting at major conferences like the American Educational Research Association and OEH and History Education Society and all these other places that are mainline conferences for people in my field. I felt like, I wanted to kill him. I really did. I've written about this in other places. So, and I say that to say that, you know, we live in a violent, toxic country in general. That's just a fact. There are mass shootings on a regular basis. People are traumatized by these things. And nobody should have to go to any university. I don't care if it's Carnegie Mellon or University of North Carolina or Stanford or Arizona State, or where a shooting like this, I think, happened sometime this past, back in the spring or sometime last year, or other places across the country where these things have occurred over the years, and go, yeah, let's excuse this one person because we didn't provide mental health services for them. No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, this is sort of a chickens come home to roost scenario. Not to be too blunt about it, like Malcolm X or something like that, but it is kind of. When you create toxic environments where people exercise power in capricious and craven and exploitative ways, right? In a country that's already violent, where guns are readily available, where, short of following what I think should ultimately happen, which is the passage of a 28th Amendment that repeals the Second Amendment entirely, you're going to see stuff like this continue to happen. That's just the bottom line. And then the decline of Western culture, whether it's in the U.S. or across Western-style nations around the world, you're going to see these kinds of things occur more and more, unfortunately, because, quite frankly, people are using their powers in such narcissistic sort of ways, right? Narcissism is rampant, right? That, the only response in kind to the violence of the socioeconomic, where people are being deprived livelihoods because of their advisors, people are being deprived degrees because of their advisors, while they're dealing with the debt of trying to pay for a lot of stuff. People are being deprived the very thing that gives their life meaning, the raison d'etre, if you want to use French, of their lives. And as a result of that, yeah, some people are going to get by. Most people quit, right? Whether it's Hollywood or academia or the nonprofit world or whatever. If you have an abusive relationship as part of your mentoring or advising or getting to know the work that you plan on doing for the rest of your life kind of thing, you tend to leave to quit more than anything else. But if you don't quit and you keep going, and you get burned out and you get depressed, which is what happened to me, and you feel a sense of betrayal, yeah, you might have murderous thoughts, you might have murderous dreams, you might even act on those. That's a different situation. Yeah, the toxicity of the world, the toxicity of academia, and how to deal with that, and the mental health stress that comes with working in toxic environments, right? That's very different than just committing domestic terrorism because you want country to remain a white man's country. That is a different area. And clearly, gun control, repealing the Second Amendment would be would be the ideal thing to happen there. But in the case of what happened at the University of North Carolina, even if we had repealed the Second Amendment, even we had gun control, all this particular student probably ended up doing is grab piano wire or grab a knife or grab a machete or grab something else to kill their advisor with. That's all what would have happened. And my thinking around that really is that, as an educated fool, as somebody who has a doctorate, who actually went through a process that was extremely abusive at times, I can not only empathize with them, but I can also say that academia needs to clean its act up. You know, there needs to be the equivalent of a Me Too movement in academia, but not just Me Too across gender. It's got to be across gender, queerness, and certainly race and age. All of those things. The elitism, the layers of elitism in academia is often what protects mediocre people who are mediocre in advising students and mediocre even in their work at times, right? I'm not saying my advisor in particular is mediocre, but I'm saying in general, right? Protects people who've had tenure and have had power for years from people who are just trying to start living their lives, trying to be the best versions of themselves they can be. And when you ruin that, the result of those things, you can't be surprised that in a violent country, people will resort to violence to deal with some of this stuff. That's all I'm saying, right? Um, and it does, in fact, relate to a lot of things I went through. The number one thing I would say, and then I'll just stop with this, for today, is the fact that, and this is one of the realizations I came into the professional world, whether it's academia or whether it was nonprofit world or even with writing, with the idea that my doing this as a professional, I could separate the personal aspects of what I went through growing up, of the things that I've had to deal with as an adult, of the experiences that I had while in school, while in higher ed, while as an adjunct professor. I could separate those personal feelings, those personal reflections from the professional. I'm an idiot. That's why I'm an educated fool. I figured out by my late 30s, no, that's not how things work. You can't be Mr. Objective. You can't be this sort of asexual blank, that sort of, that does the work and does it well, while simultaneously not have the personal. Everything's personal. The professional and the personal mingle and interact in ways similar to the fact that time is nonlinear. Neither is professional life and personal life. We can act like it's linear all we want. Okay, you keep moving up and making more money, great. But how much of your personality and the personal things, the experiences that you've had, um, impact the way you do your work, how you see the people whom you work with. Do you really trust those people? Do you really trust people in authority? No, for the most part. And the reason why is because of the experiences that I've had. So it's not surprising, right? The professional is personal. And so when people act out in personal and even murderous ways, we shouldn't be surprised that that happens in toxic environments, you know? And so that's it for now.